Today we're going to talk about how Bitcoin miners can positively or negatively impact the price of Bitcoin. It is worth a mention that the miners don't have complete control of the price, but considering that most of the miners are large-scale facilities at this point, mining up to 1 Bitcoin a day, it's definitely worth looking into what they're doing with their Bitcoin, whether they're selling it or holding on to it. And you can see this with the hash ribbons. So if you don't know what the hash ribbons are, it is a indicator that denotes when miners are capitulating by these red clouds here, or if they are holding onto their Bitcoin and waiting to sell at a higher price. Now, this isn't like normal indicators. If you see here, it doesn't change based on the time frame you're looking at. It's still all the same. And it makes sense because this is really just measuring when miners are selling off their Bitcoin or holding it, not necessarily what the price is doing. But it is very useful in my opinion. As you can see here, when we do have large miner capitulation events, we usually have a very strong move to the upside afterwards, as you can see with this buy signal here. Now this is how the chart normally looks when you pull it up. I have altered some things to change this red for marking capitulation zones. But what I'm also going to do is go in here to the settings and change this to an oscillator so we can kind of get a better idea of how strong the capitulation is. There has been a few times in history where the hash ribbons have set a buy signal, but it either A, took us a while to move up, or B, we had a small move to the downside before moving back upwards. If we go back here, I believe is when we first saw this. So as you can see here, we got a buy signal relatively close to this top here, which wasn't great. After this buy signal, we did see a move downward by about 20%. You can actually see we got multiple buy signals throughout this range here, but I think this is because the capitulation events that we saw here weren't very strong, right? You can see here that they're relatively weak compared to, say, if we go over here, we can actually see that since we have such a large capitulation event here, we moved up almost immediately. Same thing here, we got a buy signal, moved up almost immediately. Again here, as well as here. You can see back here, the first time we had a buy signal on the hash ribbons, we got a 70% move to the upside. The second time we got a 127% move to the upside. Here we actually got quite a nice move to the upside, 1000%. So on and so forth. This is actually the area that I was mentioning earlier where we had multiple buy signals in a row, but the capitulation wasn't that strong. But generally when we see miners capitulating, especially in recent history, again, since most miners nowadays are large-scale operations, you can see that once the miners are done selling their Bitcoin, we usually have a move to the upside. And this makes sense, right? If you have a large scale mining operation and they are making, 1, 2, 3, 4, even 10 Bitcoin a day mining, if they're holding on to it and not selling, the price is going to go up because there's less supply on the market. I'm going to change Bitcoin charts here real quick so that we can get a better idea of what I'm about to explain next. So put this blue line here as a reference, but if you pull up the Marathon Digital Holdings chart here, which if you don't know who this is, they are one of the largest, if not the largest, Bitcoin mining operations going on right now. You can see here that it actually has a pretty strong correlation with Bitcoin, at least after this blue line I have put. Really, before we had this capitulation in March of 2020, the chart wasn't really correlating as much. If you look back here, Bitcoin had a pretty nice move to the upside, where at the same point, Marathon was actually having a move to the downside. So again, this backs up the theory that, only up until the past couple of years have the Bitcoin miners actually gone pretty full scale in operation, which definitely influences the price of Bitcoin, in my opinion. And if you look after this blue line, the correlation is relatively strong. If you look at the left side of the screen where Bitcoin is, we've had generally the same pattern over and over again with some nuances here and there, right? Now, this doesn't mean that miners have complete control over the price action, but it does mean that they can definitely influence it. So if we kind of zoom in here, you can see that Marathon recently has been performing pretty much almost exactly the same as Bitcoin. We have a uptrending level of support here and an uptrending level of resistance for the most part. And you can see on Bitcoin, we are seeing the same thing, right? Uptrending level of support, resistance, and a uptrending level of support. But again, this doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world, especially if hype starts getting driven back into the market. If the miners sell off here, but everything starts getting bought back up that they sell, we could very well see consolidation on Bitcoin or even a move to the upside. But generally, when we do have stronger capitulation events from the miners, we usually see a move downward on Bitcoin. So watching the Marathon chart is definitely something to keep in mind, especially now that most Bitcoin operations are relatively large scale for the most part. But you can see here when we start getting these capitulation events, it's definitely worth a note to keep an eye on them. You can actually see here that we haven't gotten one yet at all in this downtrend, which is kind of interesting. I think this is because a lot of people did not expect this to happen, as a lot of indicators were saying this was the actual top. So metrics like these are very important to keep in mind when you're trying to make a play, especially within Bitcoin. The hash ribbons somewhat work on altcoins, but they're not as accurate in my opinion. But generally, when we do see a buy signal on Bitcoin and Bitcoin starts to rise again, most of the rest of the market follows. And I'll actually be making a video here soon on why Bitcoin rising might not be as much of an influence on the alts as it used to be. If you're not subscribed already, go ahead and do so you can see that video here soon. So we'll definitely have to keep an eye on the hash ribbons here in a couple of months. You can actually see that the miners that are holding Bitcoin are actually starting to taper off, which isn't a great sign. It could very well lead into capitulation events like these. If you look back here, you can actually see that the miners aren't always right. They started selling off here and the capitulation ended here, but we just kept moving higher. Although the hash ribbons did give us a pretty accurate buy signal of around here, which you can see, within a couple weeks, we actually blasted out of this zone. Hash ribbons are definitely something that I kind of keep in my back pocket and look at every now and again, although I don't use it a lot in my technical analysis, again, because it isn't a time frame based thing. It's more of a what are miners doing at this point in time. So if you learned something today, go ahead and hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and do so as I try to post content daily. As always, this isn't financial advice, and I'll see you in the next one.